SpongeBob, Shrek, The Daily Show, Sailor Moon, boy bands, sports enthusiasts, Sherlock Holmes, Barbie, Britney Spears, Hello Kitty, Jandek, comic books, superheroes, Buffy. These are just some of the many, many topics I cover on my podcast, How to Stan, a show about both specific fandoms and just pop culture, internet trends overall. Check out How to Stan in the same feed as my other podcast, 17 Karat K-Pop, wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm an independent creator, and so please spread the word about the show. There's an episode for every interest, and I really do appreciate the support, spreading the word. You can also find out more info at my site, 17karatkpop.weebly.com. Thanks so much. Let's pick up the story exactly where we left off. I recommend you listen to the parts before getting to this. October 1982. Stephen Loyacano takes his own life and is accused of having made a pact with the devil. His death is compared to Jay's journal, and the authors are two people who wrote Satanism, Is Your Family Safe? People are really scared too because this is the year of the Tylenol murders, as well as some big SRA claims in California. And lots more we don't have time to get into. Feels like the society is being torn apart at the seams. And then you had the fear-stoked more by quite an irresponsible, frankly, piece of reporting, where a Brigham Young University paper, 7th East Press, releases a big expose called Beyond Jay's Journal, Dispelling Occult Myths. Lots of similar exposés were a trend in writing at this time, like Devil Child, Say You Love Satan, and other pieces that they're very headline-ready. Alden's family was not asked for comment at any point during this story, but Beatrice got a comment, and she was asked just, hey, how much of Jay's journal is really true? And she said, quote, entries in any diary are irregular and somewhat sketchy. It is often necessary to fill in the gaps to make it more readable and coherent, unquote. Some of these supposedly reliable sources about the witchcraft phenomenon in their area included someone who they said is, quote, a local counselor who has talked to numerous youths involved with such groups. Another reliable source is a high school student who says, quote, I've heard of human sacrifice in other parts of the country, but I'm not aware of any occurring in this area. It has been an open discussion at times, though. Spring of '83. Special Agent Keith Lanning, the head of profiling at the FBI, starts getting a bunch of calls about different reports of occult behavior of SRA, and it kind of baffles him that there are so many. And he decides to organize a meeting. He's like, we need a 4-day retreat. A bunch of specialists come in to Quantico, and we are going to have a big, serious debate. Separate fact from fiction, figure out what the heck is going on, what this phenomenon really is, and how much is just hype. So he plans for that big event. This is also the year child psychiatrist Mary Giffen publishes A Cry for Help, which really blasts and blames Jay's parents, who are really Alden's parents, for his fate. Puts all the blame on them. '83 is also the year that the Michelle Remembers duo does some advising on the big McMartin preschool trial in California. It all starts with a preschool teacher, Ray Bucky, and then another staffer there, followed by Peggy McMartin of SRA. They were really shocked by these claims and maintained their innocence, but ultimately, they were charged with 65 counts. In the beginning, it was over 100 alleged victims, but ultimately in court, 65 different counts. The big problem here was that the person who interviewed these supposed child victims, Kee McFarlane, a social worker for the Children's Institute International, she was unaccredited, an unlicensed psychotherapist. Recruited by police, in essence recruited by the prosecution side, to interview 400 kids, basically in the hopes of getting enough of them to come forward to make this seem like a valid charge. This is considered to be an ultimate example, in hindsight, of social contagion, and it created a ripple effect of over 100 other preschools across the USA being charged. And again, more breathless reporting of every little trial update really helped the story's perceived validity grow and grow, as media outlets then reported on each other's leads. You could also argue the media may have biased a jury because McMartin and Bucky's names were really dragged through the mud. They were really villainized by the public. The way Kee McFarlane interviewed those 400 kids and came up with over 100 supposed examples of SRA, she used a method that is very coercive and condemned by many professionals. So this McMartin trial was not just a great example of social contagion, but also a great example of the power dynamic between adults and kids. Because if a kid sees an adult reacting positively to some things, they want to repeat that and get that adult praise. Similarly, if the adult looks disappointed or ashamed of them, they want to correct the behavior. Obviously super generalizations, and I don't have a license in psychology, but basically adults have certain cues they can follow to teach their kids to listen or not. And that's what she did in these interviews. If they suddenly remembered certain details of SRA, suppressed memories of SRA, she basically rewarded them and talked in a way that coaxed them to tell her more. If they couldn't tell her more, they just couldn't think of anything to say, she acted with disappointment. So it was a misleading and coercive process, again by an unlicensed professional, so-called professional. This ultimately resulted in 0 convictions, but it took 7 years in court, 3 years of testimony, a deadlock jury on 13 charges, 11 choosing not guilty, but it was considered a deadlock because that was not unanimous, an acquittal on 52 other charges. Then Bucky was charged again, yet still not convicted. And to make this example even more sensational, this officially became one of the most expensive criminal cases, and the longest running ones, in United States history. Spring 1984. A housing development in a rich area, Country Walk, really gets hit with a wave of satanic panic, and a Cuban immigrant, 36-year-old Francisco Fuster, is accused, along with his wife, of SRA. A mom went to pick up her son from daycare, from babysitting, saw him looking irritable and sleepy, and assumed he had been drugged there. Pretty soon an investigation was launched, eventually leading to 8 alleged victims in their care, and these kids were interviewed and didn't really have anything damning to say. There was one 5-year-old interviewed who kind of contradicted himself during the first interview. But on the second interview, and then the third one, those show him laying out a very not contradictory, detailed, more concise, supposedly believable story. This is a great example of when founded and unfounded concerns converge, because he really did have a criminal past, a past manslaughter guilty plea, plus there was the concern over his undocumented wife, who was only 17. However, that has no bearing on culpability in an SRA case. That was just totally fabricated. Yet he was sentenced to 6 life sentences with no parole eligibility until the year 2134. Eventually, one of the boys who, when he was younger, was coerced into claiming, okay, yes, I was a victim of SRA, I'll testify in court to please these adults, he later did come out and admit, that's what I did. I was scared to go against what they seemed to be coaxing me to say. And he also said, look, I said what they clearly wanted to hear because I wanted the interview to end. Remember, he was a little kid. So even just aside from any deeper meaning, he was bored, done answering questions, and it sounded like if he said yes, I was a victim of SRA, gave them what they were looking for, they would let him leave. Long story short, the 17-year-old wife eventually ended up getting a lesser punishment by testifying against her husband, although she later withdrew and admitted her own allegation against him was false. This story was also really mired in politics. This was right before Janet Reno was going to get reelected. She was a state attorney at the time and saw this as a big boost to her campaign to show she's tough on crime and cracking down and securing convictions, cracking down on the SRA epidemic. Reno won re-election in a landslide. And actually, before Reno won re-election, she went in person and spoke at one of Fuster's pretrial hearings to vouch in person, argue in person they ought to be convicted. She wanted to be caught trying, and she was. 1984, the Fell Acres Daycare Center is hit with SRA accusations against a married couple and the man's sister. The 3 family members in Malden, Massachusetts, are convicted. One spends 10 years in prison, the other 20, and the third person dies in prison before her conviction is overturned. And she is exonerated the year after death. Between 1984 and 1986, at least 26 people are locked up following claims of SRA. It will later come out, in these different cases, kids had been coerced in ways similar to Key McFarlane's tactics that are just quite unethical and, of course, leading questions that don't get to the real truth. One man even served 20 years behind bars before being freed. Key McFarlane's star stayed rising, and she spoke in Congress that year about the dangers of the SRA epidemic. Congress soon doubled the Child Protection Program's budget. Patricia Pulling, the BADD founder, was also an influential voice on Capitol Hill and became the director of the National Coalition on TV Violence. This was also a time where the paranoia stayed strong among parents due to all the reports of this killer clown who was haunting the streets. And he was executed in '84, which kept the media buzz alive about Ronald Clark O'Brien. This is also the year Lauren Stratford starts incorporating Satanism into her true stories. True is in quotes there. She gets a book deal and publishes Satan's Underground, the extraordinary story of one woman's escape. Turns out the woman who had claimed her son must have been drugged because he looked sleepy after leaving the babysitters. She was a high school friend of the author behind a similar book. And also in '84, one couple had to leave Bakersfield with their kids after plainclothes officers started casing their house, seeing them as suspicious after SRA allegations, and fearing for their safety and threats towards their kids and themselves. They spent a year basically like nomads, having to live place to place. The cops actually eventually caught up to them, took their kids away from them, and put them in foster care before pressuring them to testify against their own parents at custody hearings. The community jails at this time were so stuffed with other falsely accused parents, it was just the scars made from this SRA wave in Bakersfield cannot be overstated. February 1985. Finally, Special Agent Lanning gets to have his big conference where a bunch of specialists convene for the 4-day seminar in Quantico, hoping to separate fact from fiction about what the heck is going on with these rumors. He was surprised when it turns out the other people who came were not of the same mind as him, ready to just go in with an open mind, start from a place of facts, and speculate after that. A lot of the people invited to the meeting, professionals, specialists, credentialed, smart people, came in with the assumption this was a legit concern, not mass hysteria, and they were operating from the assumption we're at this meeting not to figure out what's happening, but to figure out how to address it, how to really clamp down on it. One of the influential speakers at this event, Sandra Gallant, aka Sandy, she was held in really high esteem even before this conference, really sought out for advice by fellow professionals. And she passed out pamphlets at this event, basically listing things to look out for regarding SRA. A couple months later, she actually testified as an expert witness in a court case in Contra Costa County. This led to a hung jury and a mistrial. But she now had the extra layer of credibility because she could say, when I spoke at Quantico at this special agent seminar, March 1985, Lynn Bryson, the person I mentioned before, had a failed radio gig and other failed star turns, now is giving packed lectures about supposedly satanic celebrities influencing your kids. He went off on Georgia Frontier, owner of the LA Rams, as well as John Lennon. He also claimed to have dated Sharon Tate, which is an unlikely possibility considering that although they did go to the same high school, their time there did not overlap at all. Other people who had failed in different media pursuits, career endeavors, etc., were discovering they could have the fame they wanted and a lucrative lifestyle by joining in and giving lectures about SRA threats. These were packed events. April, also in 1985, Patricia Pulling, as well as one of the authors of Michelle Remembers, get lots of airtime to espouse their views, tout their projects on 60 Minutes. This is also the summer when a 5-day series runs in the Daily Herald called Satan Worship in Zion, Zion being a slang term for part of Utah. Shortly after this series runs, someone steals Alden's gravestone. It is quickly returned, but now faces the wrong way. It would continue to be vandalized until Alden's parents eventually decide to put the headstone in storage. 85 is also the year Frank Fuster gets convicted. His wife eventually gets 10 years, much less because of a deal based on her cooperation against her husband. It was quite an interesting turn of events because the attorney for Frank Fuster became a prosecutor in this case, switching sides to rep his wife. He just felt like there was no way Frank would not get convicted. So he started portraying his wife, Elena, as a victim of him, someone who was under duress whenever she took part in SRA. Later, in a sworn deposition, it's confirmed that the author of Unspeakable Acts left her job at Channel 6 soon after the Fusters' investigation started. She soon left Channel 6 to become a paid consultant for the prosecution sent to interview kids who may have been victims of SRA. The Channel 6 staff had apparently been trying to create a connecting story, a tie-in connecting the McMartin trial to what was going down in Country Walk, to point to a broader conspiracy, a broader chain of SRAs. And she left her position to go help in the legal realm reinforce that case. This is a bizarre example of someone who really made it big as a lecturer. An Ohio cop, Dale Griffiths, got a cult studies PhD, basically from a diploma mill. Then he claimed to know where a mass gravesite was where a deadly satanic ritual had taken place. When people actually said, okay, let's look into that claim, they went and dug up the area and came up with nothing. So then he pointed out a red string on the ground and said, red string actually symbolizes an indicator that a ritual previously took place here. So I was right. And I kid you not, they were like, that makes sense. And they got really freaked out. And he became a go-to when needing consulting on this topic. 1986, Ray and Peggy, as well as Virginia and Peggy Ann McMartin, are charged officially. 135 counts of SRA, and they're found guilty, with Raymond serving 5 years, Peggy 2 years, and LA County having spent over $15 million. After 8 years of official trial proceedings, the sentences are officially overturned, eventually. This is also the year Gerald, from the Fell Acres daycare case, is convicted for allegedly committing SRA against 9 kids. He gets 30 to 40 years. The kids testified against him face-to-face in court, which would not be allowed today. You would have to be videotaped or in a separate room some other way. But that public-facing deposition may have had an impact on what was said. By this year, social worker Carol Darling claims in front of a grand jury that members of the government might be involved in these satanic groups too, implying that there is a broad conspiracy of SRA and that it's infiltrated the highest levels of government and society. Her husband was also a fellow preacher of these fears. Sandy, from the Quantico lecture, tells an accidentally revealing thing to the San Francisco Examiner, quote, "The problem is that we are not finding any bodies," unquote. Now, I know she meant to make it sound like the problem is we know this is happening and they're getting rid of the bodies and we can't find them. But to me, it basically is admitting, yeah, we can't find any evidence for our claims. That's the problem. And in 86, the largest yet SRA advocacy, anti-SRA advocacy led symposium takes place in Australia. A main speaker, Key McFarlane. In 1987, a list of indicators someone may be an SRA victim with suppressed memories of it circulates, as well as a widely talked about Geraldo Rivera special called Devil Worship, Exposing Satan's Underground. This becomes the highest rated TV documentary to ever air by that point. The special became a classic, screened at Protestant gatherings, serving as a PSA about demonic possession. Many other TV specials came out around this time, threatening about the SRA risks out there, and will become used at screenings of not just religious groups, but anyone who wanted to scare kids basically off of drugs, scare parents off of letting their kids do whatever. It became quite a useful propaganda tool for different actors. It also claimed, without evidence, over 1 million Satanists lived in the U.S. running a secret, organized network for their SRA. Just some of the many sensationalized, media-heavy trials that commenced in 87. One case dubbed the British McMartin Preschool Trial in Nottingham. An eerie resemblance, right down to the details, to the McMartin case. The case does lead to official criminal charges, but they end up being quite unrelated to what they sought out at first to find. The mom and sister, in the Fall Acres case, are convicted and sentenced to 8 to 20 years. And accusations against Little Rascals Daycare in North Carolina lead to a bus driver being arrested, and he was never released. 1988, Lauren Stratford is now really at her superstar peak, a popular speaker against Satanism, given a ton of credibility when she goes on Oprah, talking about her so-called memoir, Satan's Underground, her harrowing childhood, and the overall epidemic here. She also claimed to have experienced events identical to what you could read in a different memoir, Sybil, about someone with multiple personalities. Despite her past as a pathological liar already being solidified, she made great TV, so of course she was on the show. But prior to being booked, she lied about a lot of stuff that was pretty obvious. For example, she said she was abused by her stepmother, despite never having a stepmother. She also, for a time, lived with an elderly couple and faked blindness while there. She got kicked out of living with them once the jig was up because she accidentally pointed out a landmark and they realized she wasn't blind. She also had kept changing basic facts about the story of SRA roping in her kids. Sometimes she said one of her kids had been a victim, other times 3 of her kids, and other times she said she actually didn't have kids and was sterile. This had just happened to her. March 1988, 1 month later, Satanic Panic hit Stuart, Florida, following a surge of psychologists moving into the area and apparently discovering proof of SRA. They gathered over 60 children's testimonies. They even had listening devices placed in classrooms. School grounds were searched for mass graves. A preschool owner and his wife were arrested. And one alleged victim, then 12-year-old Kristen Erickson, eventually came forward years later and opened up about realizing over time how much she had been manipulated into believing she was an SRA victim. Kids are very impressionable. In August, Patricia Pulling's book is published called The Devil's Web: Who is Stalking Your Children for Satan? One piece of advice in her book: you should start asking your teens what's going on by asking if they've read H.P. Lovecraft's Necronomicon. This is also the year Michael A. Stackpole releases a book called Game Hysteria and the Truth, debunking a bunch of claims Pulling and Company had made against brands like D&D. A year later, he would keep up the attack against BADD in what he called the Pulling Report, pointing out a bunch of shoddy data methods BADD had been using. September 1988, rumors fly through Caldwell County, Kentucky, about a supposed planned series of attacks by Satanists. Gun sales skyrocket in response. People brace for impact, basically just shut their doors and fear the worst. Nothing of the kind ever happened, no attacks whatsoever. Also the month, Tom Wedge gives lectures on Satanism, making around $26,000 per speaking gig. And at his lectures were some civilians, but for the most part influential people like social workers and cops. Sandy gives an influential interview to a UK paper, which is followed by an uptick in SRA claims across the UK, who suddenly realize we were SRA victims as kids too. This is also when that Oprah episode airs with Lauren Stratford and about Michelle Smith's story. February 1990. Satanic Panic reaches Caroline County, Maryland. There is a big suicide mental health crisis in Maryland, and they respond by cutting 25% of the budget for suicide prevention and other mental health programs at schools. They cut that budget 25% following SRA claims against these schools. By September 1990, Lawrence, who co-wrote Michelle Remembers, has consulted in over 1,000 SRA cases and is held in super high esteem. November 1990, psychiatrist, researcher, and chief of the Dissociative Disorders Unit of the National Institute of Mental Health runs a panel at a Maryland conference, considered the first of its time. This is the first public panel based in actual skepticism, not just assumed out of the gates SRA claims are real, but a conference that starts with questions and no answers the questions overtly lead to from the onset. But of course SRA believers attack this event and blast it as a disinformation campaign. Also in 1990, This is the decade psychologist D. Corridon Hammond publishes his theories about hypnotherapy sessions' impacts. He claims his report confirms that certain code words hypnotherapists use can help resurface SRA memories. Also going back to the classic anti-Semitic angle of many conspiracy theorists, he says his patients revealed to him the mastermind behind the whole SRA organization was a Jewish doctor working for the CIA. This is also the year a 2020 feature on SRA shows a lot of graphic footage, disturbing claims, and even shows an official exorcism. This is also when Unspeakable Acts gets a TV adaptation. Go Ask Alice appears on the list of most banned or challenged books in America. The international focus continues with a wave of SRA accusations hitting New Zealand. And the McMartin preschool is razed. Yet this is also the year Raymond is acquitted. It seems like the tide is finally turning more skeptical in 91, when the American Association of Suicidology, the CDC, and the Health and Welfare Canada organization all come out with reports confirming no link between fantasy games and suicides. However, the hysteria continues in 92, when an Austin, Texas daycare owner is accused of SRA. A wave of SRA accusations spreads to Norway. A man in North Carolina is convicted of SRA and is never released, never exonerated. This is also the year the Justice Department issues a major report debunking a ton of these claims of some big organized group. But of course, conspiracy theorists think the government is in on the plot, so of course they're going to say that. This is also the year the Oak Hill Daycare Center is hit with a wave of SRA claims, sentencing Dan and Frances Keller to 48 years. The ER physician who testified against them later recants. May 1993. Nancy Miller Smith, a single mom of 4 kids, a school bus driver for Ohio's Head Start program, and a staff member for Meals on Wheels, is accused. This accusation involves no evidence, one sole claim from a mom. The supposed victim said nothing of the kind, and her bus log and odometer both checking out as typical. Nothing different happened on her bus route that day. She did not detour to go somewhere and perform a satanic ritual. This mom, who made the claim, had a history of drug use herself and was mentally ill. Nancy's bus aide said nothing happened unusual. And at the time of the supposed SRA, Nancy had been on a Meals on Wheels route. School attendance proof also contradicts the mom's claim that her daughter was not at school that day. Every kid on her bus ride that day said nothing like that happened. And when asked who the supposed perpetrator Joseph, the co-conspirator, was, they had said they never heard of him. This mom was relentless, though, so she started contacting Head Start parents to get them to all be on her side, telling them Joseph and Nancy had done these horrible things. She kept it up even after Nancy passed her lie detector test. She reported to the mayor, she had a meeting with the mayor and police chief. She went to the media, who helped boost the story, and her quotes about the cops doing a cover-up. Her media portrayals were very sketchy, though, because she kept changing her description of this Joseph character. Authorities did not believe this woman, and tried to talk her down from this fight, but she was relentless. They eventually did get her off of their backs, basically, by charging a working-class black man named Joseph, who Nancy had never actually met. This Joseph did have a prior criminal record, but again, like in the Fuster case, that has no bearing on guilt in this SRA claim. Children were then asked to pick him out of a photo lineup. Only one of the 10 could do so. The jury was not allowed to see videotape of an in-person lineup, which would prove to them kids were not identifying him there either, and those who did had been literally poked by their parents to do so. One authority figure who had been adamant, guys, we are really hounding this poor woman, this poor sweet Meals on Wheels driver and Head Start bus driver. There's no case here. The prosecutors, who were very headstrong about convicting her, removed him from their team and started their own in pursuit of this Joseph. One woman actually said, well, my kid didn't identify Joseph in the lineup because he was scared to do so. He had broken out into hysterics at the sight of him, traumatized, and had to leave the room. Again, if the jury had been able to see the video, they would have seen that was so not true. And the son didn't look concerned at all. In fact, he was kind of enjoying himself. In a weird plot twist, apropos of nothing, I just want to share this interesting fact. This kid later learned his mom wasn't even his real mom, and he had been kidnapped at 3 days old. The prosecution eventually had just one witness who did claim Joseph had scared the kids and been on the bus one day. Failing to mention, though, they thought he might have been a dad of one of the kids on that bus, not just some stranger. 93 is also the year the AIDS epidemic is top of mind in the US. And editors are getting their first look at a new book. She's back, Beatrice Sparks, with another journal. It Happened to Nancy. A story of a 14-year-old girl assaulted by an older man who gives her AIDS, and she dies a quick death from it. But despite all the anguish her body goes through, till the very end she stays optimistic. It's supposed to be a powerful, moving, true story. Later in the book, Nancy fangirls over meeting Beatrice Sparks. And in the book, there's a section where Nancy is elated to meet this iconic superstar therapist, despite the fact Nancy's a 14-year-old supposedly, and Sparks hadn't come out with a book at that point in over a decade. Also sketchy was the identical and near-identical phrasing from Jay's journal and Go Ask Alice that was repurposed into It Happened to Nancy. And of course the fact-checking was odd. The facts in quotes came from people with titles like one of Nancy's doctors, literally that's what it said, AIDS specialist, and psychiatrist working with AIDS. Sparks insisted all research had been vetted by the CDC, despite oddities just technically like how Nancy would go from HIV to AIDS in 2 years. That tends to take 10 years or longer. Also, it was later revealed, Sparks flat out invented a doctor who gave a quote to this book in another one of hers, Dr. Philip Morgenstern, totally made up. June 1993, the West Memphis 3 case, when 3 teens in Arkansas, who are just into the goth life, are accused of being satanic, engaging in SRA, and being guilty of the murder of 3 young boys. They become the topic of the documentary Paradise Lost. They enter Alford pleas and spend 18 years in prison each. More from 93, a Utah Valley Community College building is renamed in the honor of Lavorne Sparks, the Sparks Automotive Building. They continue to have this massive clout locally. And a Massachusetts Supreme Court Judicial Court reverses a judge's earlier ruling that had reduced the Fell Acres daycare staff sentences. April 1994, Satanic Panic sweeps Wenatchee, Washington. 43 adults are charged with over 26,000 counts of SRA, and 24 are convicted. 1994 is when Satanic Panic, a book by Jeffrey Victor, wins an award from the Free Press Association. This book actually was a debunking book that determined Satanic Panic had been just this ultimate scapegoat for a host of social ills that had plagued the country the past few decades. And he also wrote about how certain people were more likely to believe these SRA claims, including the rural, poorly educated, white, blue-collar people who are economically anxious and socially and religiously conservative. They feared the changing country from their conservative way of life, and they had economic anxiety, both attributed to their proneness to want to pin the blame for social ills, as they saw it, on one singular thing, and they chose the occult. 94 is also when Special Agent Lanning releases a report that basically admits everything was kind of made up. There's no evidence to SRA being an epidemic. This was all mass hysteria. And this report is used to help free some of the accused and overturn some convictions. A key quote, "The focus on the satanic or bizarre elements did not prevent investigators from doing their job. It just made it difficult to prove what actually happened," unquote. 2 years later, the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect would commission a study of these claims and realized cases had been put forth by nearly 7,000 mental health professionals. More from 1994. A police training video comes out that still implicates a satanic element in some crimes. Not as some footnote, but as the main theme of the video. The video is called The Law Enforcement Guide to Satanic Cults. This year, a huge nationwide survey of over 11,000 claims from cops and psych workers shows that in total, approximately 12,000 accusations of SRA had been made with zero substance. This is also the year Nancy Smith and Joseph are tried and convicted. Nancy gets 30 to 94 years, but is later exonerated. Joseph gets 5 life sentences and is never freed. In 94, a Nixon policy advisor admits, quote, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by criminalizing drugs heavily, we could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did," unquote. Although the Satanic Panic was thought to have kind of ended between 92 and 95, obviously its aftermath remains with us, more on that in a minute. And it is interesting how the phenomenon kind of died down the same way it started. It fed on itself. The buzz fed on itself, and now the skepticism fed on itself. And all of the authority figures, media outlets, etc., worked up over these claims were now bent on debunking them, and the collective mentality changed. However, this had become a global export, the mentality. And in the mid-90s, Egypt's tabloids reported about a so-called satanic group within their midst, among middle and upper class youths spreading their metal music, graffiti, other devilish interests. As a result, some local musicians even had their homes raided and tapes and CDs confiscated. Some were also forced to cut their hair and be reprogrammed in terms of religious views. In 1995, Indictment, the McMartin Trial, an HBO movie, is released, and it casts Ray Bucky in a new light. Now he is portrayed as a victim of egregious prosecutorial misconduct and conspiracies. This is also the year charges are overturned in the Martinsville case. They determined those interviews that had been used as testimony were not valid. 2 of those convicted in the Fell Acres daycare story are freed after 8 years behind bars, winning an appeal. But the conviction eventually is reinstated and stays that way until one of them dies. A motion for a new trial is set for one of them, but the judge slams everyone who validated the shoddy interviews that took place and became the foundation for this case. Yet the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court still ruled in favor of sending her back to prison. This is also the year Geraldo Rivera finally issues an apology for the TV special that at this point was 8 years old. November 1996. Sparks attends the National Book Awards. She's still really admired and chosen as a panelist on a 5-person judging panel for the Young People's Literature category. Big culminating moment where she's among the A-list in the world of literature like she's always dreamed of. But she does not get to really be the star of the show still. She still gets jealous of the others there. This is the year she publishes Almost Lost, the true story of an anonymous teenager's life on the streets. This is supposedly a book that the case file was turned into of a 15-year-old patient of hers, Sammy, who comes from a broken home and suddenly Dr. B saves him. Yeah, she put herself as the main hero in her book, saving Sammy, turning his life around, and helping his parents as well avoid drugs and salvage their marriage. In 96, Gillian Jacobs, then a teenager, finds and falls in love with Go Ask Alice, another author I really resonated with. The investigation confirms over 12,000 false SRA allegations at the height of Satanic Panic happened. Skepticism has grown, but not for Beatrice Sparks. This is the year the main witness in the Wenatchee, Washington case recants, admits to making everything up, and that she lied to appease her dad, who was law enforcement, leading the investigation. People are starting to atone for their false assumptions. There's astrobiologist and astrophysicist Carl Sagan, who publishes a book really slamming the whole Satanic Panic, dedicates a whole chapter to the unsubstantiated theories perpetuated about UFO abduction claims. It's called The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. Also published that year, Special Agent Lanning's report basically admitting I was so tunnel-visioned, leaning into the wrong things. It's called The Witch Hunt, The Backlash, and Professionalism. And he ended up getting an FBI Director's Award for special achievement on behalf of missing and exploited kids. Also published that year, Alden Barrett's brother Scott's book about Alden's life, A Place in the Sun. He wanted him to be remembered in a different kind of memoir. In 1997, there is a new wave of Satanic Panic, because we never learn. It gained steam in some conservative states due to a rise in homophobia, and 4 gay women, named the San Antonio Four, are charged with SRA. They each spend 15 years in prison. Also that year, Patricia Pulling dies of lung cancer, and no one takes up the mantle of BADD, so the group basically falls apart. In 1998, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer publishes a 5-part investigation revealing massive misconduct and unprofessionalism in the Wenatchee Police Department among prosecutors and therapists. But the last of the wrongly convicted in that case would not be released for another 3 years. 98 is the year a book called Speak of the Devil is published, concluding there is no cabal and only rituals that could be found were just kind of fake, posed. So in the very rare instances where an assault took place with a satanic angle, it was just a fear factor, not like a legit occult ceremony, language weaponized to scare the victim. 98 is also the year Beatrice Sparks goes on a tirade against a new website, goaskalice.com. It has nothing to do with her book, it's a Columbia University advice column. What further ticked her off was discovering they also were selling a companion book called the Go Ask Alice Book of Answers. By this year, Go Ask Alice itself was outselling Sylvia Plath by more than 2-1. So naturally she was ticked off, thinking someone was cashing in on her legacy, wrote them a super strongly worded angry letter. July 2001. A Massachusetts parole board recommends Gerald from the Fellacres case have a sentence commuted. That decision gets rejected, though. 2001 is also when a book is published by journalist Debbie Nathan called Satan's Silence, highlighting the irony of what happened. Supposed child victims were silenced throughout all of this. By trying to give voice to the children were manipulated and coerced into saying what parents wanted them to, even those who didn't realize what they were doing. The ones who subconsciously fed into the hysteria. 2003, Dr. Doyle Barrett, Alden's dad, dies at 77 and is buried next to his son. This is also the year Lavorne dies, at 88. In 2004, Gerald of the Fellacres case is finally released from prison. 2005, Finding Katie, The Diary of Anonymous, a Teenager in Foster Care, by Beatrice Sparks, is released. Now it's time to reveal that the jig is up. Not really for her. To this day, some people still think books like Go Ask Alice were real. But the real truth is, Beatrice Sparks never really got her comeuppance, but she made up everything, all these years. Alice never existed. That wasn't a diary given to her. She wasn't even a licensed therapist. Beatrice was driven by the savior complex. The kernels of truth are that she did volunteer at a hospital and that summer camp, where she met people who became the basis for Alice's character. It turns out Toby and Brenda, Toby the woman at that Mormon camp who was trying to look out for Brenda, who was having a really tough time mentally, that was the story upon which Beatrice Sparks based Go Ask Alice. But she obviously changed a whole lot about the story and made herself a character in it who saved the day. She was a high school dropout, but she had claimed over time to have gone to 5 different schools, kept changing the account. When she was in one state, she would say she went to school in the other, and vice versa. A woman named Beatrice Sparks did attend UCLA, but the timing wouldn't have worked out. That's just a lucky coincidence. She actually could have been criminally charged for impersonating someone with a psych license, but that never happened. She also touted early achievements. Back when she was freelancing in California, her bio included descriptions of her promising publications from the Anthology of American Poetry. The quotes praising her work came from the Malibu Monitor, that sole source where Sparks also wrote under a pen name. And she did have poetry published in a book called Exposition Press, which basically just lets people pay for space in a public work. No one ever questioned all of the weird holes in Alice's story or any of her others. Once Go Ask Alice had credibility, every diary or case study she claimed to have adapted into a book was taken as trustworthy, as truth. But she kept changing her accounts and no one seemed to notice. Sometimes she would say, I just lightly edited for grammar and stuff. Other times she had apparently practically co-written it. Sometimes she made it sound like she just flat out acquired it and didn't change a thing. Sometimes she even said it wasn't a diary, someone had given her audio tapes. It varied very widely. And to this day, Lavorne Jr. says he doesn't really know what of her backstory is true or not. Remember, this all started with a pathologically lying mom who claimed she gave birth in a mining town, mid-train ride, jumped off the train for it. No one else noticed some other suspicions about her life. So much she outright lied about or claims that she dodged. Different phrases from her books were literally copied and pasted, reused in her other books. That didn't draw red flags, nor did different pen names and her suspicious-sounding identical syntax use. There were also general things that didn't make sense. In terms of AIDS, the claims made didn't match science, nor did the claims of how Alice went from different drugs to each other, the way she had a gateway effect, not exactly how it goes down. Plus, she never answered how Alice kept a diary in the first place in the psych ward, where I'm pretty sure you couldn't get a pen or pencil. Patients would not be allowed that. And again, in Jay's journal, she even had him quote articles and stuff that didn't come out until after his supposed death. So chronologically and factually riddled with errors that no one noticed. Also kind of very darkly, tragically funny is how one really young boy in Voices supposedly found a way to recite from memory a whole Gerald Ford speech, as young teen boys are prone to do. And he also referenced a TV show that premiered a year after his supposed interview. Those vinyl records for the MLM scheme, turns out she plagiarized some of that writing too. The thing that's really infuriating, though, is that she knew she was lying. It's not genuine journalistic mistakes or slip-ups. This was overt lying for fame, for attention. She knew what she was doing. And the way she tried to wink and nod to that, pretty overt in hindsight. There is a diary entry in Go Ask Alice that says, quote, "Even now I'm not really sure which parts of myself are real and which parts are things I've gotten from books," unquote. Finding Katie has a passage in it that says, quote, "Maybe my whole old life is a crazy hodgepodge of things I've read or seen in movies or on TV," unquote. Katie, this final main character, quite a finale to end on as a writer, is also having all these meta moments, pointing out how she doesn't even know what's a lie and what's the truth. She's trying to create narratives in her head. But then Katie finds solace and freedom in the fact that, quote, "that didn't seem to matter," unquote, referring to all the lies she told. No one noticed, and she loves it. And basically, the story ends sounding like this teen version of Beatrice is adopted by a loving, older parent version of Beatrice in a book written by Beatrice. And the final sentence is, quote, "I am somebody for eternity," unquote. The same year as Finding Katie, another notable book added to the skepticism and probably embarrassment the public had for their past hysteria. Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning by Jonathan Mahler, all about the Son of Sam's case and its impact on the media. And he says, quote, "The frenzied coverage fanned the growing sense of fear. The growing sense of fear fanned the frenzied coverage," unquote. In 2006, psychologist and attorney Christopher Barden drafts an amicus curiae brief to California's Supreme Court, signed by almost 100 experts in the field of memory. Now things are coming to light about how memory works, period. December 2007, Marcella Barrett dies at 83 and is buried next to her first husband, Brian. Also that year, Meredith Kircher is a woman killed in Italy, and her roommate, Amanda Knox, is accused of doing it. This involves satanic influences, apparently. The prosecutors claim Knox was involved in, quote, "Lucifer-like, satanic, demonic, diabolical, a witch of deception," unquote, activity. In 2008, Barbara Snow, a therapist in Salt Lake City, is sentenced to probation for planting false memories in her patients. For making up those memories, she actually gets probation. In early 2009, Nancy Smith, the Meals on Wheels driver, and Joseph Allen, the villainized black man, had to be resentenced due to a clerical error. But instead the judge decided to just release them both, at least until their trial date. But long story short, they did eventually get acquitted, prosecutors appealed to get the conviction reinstated, and then the Ohio Innocence Project got involved, filed a clemency petition. So even years after, doubts have grown about everything associated with the SRA mass hysteria. The effects legally and in people's day-to-day lives, those are continuing. In 2010, Art Linkletter dies at 97. 2011, the West Memphis Three are finally released after 18 years in prison, thanks to DNA evidence. This is really something. May 25th, 2012, Beatrice Sparks dies at age 95, and when the author of that article, The House Alice Built, goes to the funeral, she finds out, despite not having seen this woman in over 30 years, Beatrice Sparks held onto such a grudge against that reporting that she specifically made a note to ban this reviewer from her funeral. She was blocked from the funeral because of a 30-plus year grudge about not even a bad book review, just a very honest article that said, look, she did not provide educational credentials or other proof of what she was saying. She sent her daughter instead to take notes. Yet, Beatrice Sparks continues to make some money, and Simon & Schuster releases this Anonymous Diaries series of similar stories. In 2013, the Oak Hill daycare center owners finally are released after 20 years, and a deal is struck between Nancy Smith's lawyers and prosecutors, so she gets time served in exchange for promising no further legal action. This deal is allowed for that Meals on Wheels white bus driver Nancy, but not for the black man they targeted, Joseph, who goes back to prison. He gets a parole hearing in early 2014, but is denied, and gives up his right to an appeal, which some believe he did under duress. 2015, Amanda Knox is exonerated. There's an appeal, an acquittal, a reconviction, a reacquittal, and media perpetuating some satanic conspiracy theories. This is also the year the San Antonio Four have their convictions overturned. In 2016, yet again, moral panic spreads about a supposed creepy clown. This is also the year Pizzagate happens, and other conspiracy theories related to new allegations of another cabal that is involved in the U.S. government. These conspiracy theorists also claim Marina Abramovich, a performance artist who performs at a dinner party, was actually performing a satanic ritual, not just any old performance. This is because they find out about this party through an email leak of a DNC staffer, and they think it's a long story, but it's affiliated with QAnon basically, although the first Q drop officially on the website 4chan did not come about until November 2017. But QAnon definitely traffics in all of the theories we've already laid out from decades ago. It's very uncreative. Also in 2017, a district attorney declares the daycare owners Dan and Fran, the Kellers, actually innocent. In 2018, the San Antonio Four's criminal record are officially expunged. 2019, the FBI labels QAnon in the United States as a domestic terrorist threat because it's linked to some acts of real-world violence and threats of violence against this so-called cabal that some people have started believing in. They're doing it, they say, for the children. Again, ironic how there are a few children who actually get a say here. Everything is done on behalf of them. In August 2020, a handful of political parties slam the Dutch Minister of Justice and Safety for not ordering an independent investigation they requested into SRA allegations, and this minister's refusal to create that committee is bypassed by the House. More money is made from the Go Ask Alice brand in December 2020 when Simon & Schuster releases a special edition. The inside copyright page is now labeled fiction. Also in 2020, the reporter behind the Satan Worship in Zion expose downplays his role in that series and actually throws his colleague, who's dead now, under the bus, saying she mostly did it. It was her idea. Meanwhile, the conspiracy theorists who continue to find the performer Abramovich suspicious and satanic try and succeed at shutting down a project she was working on with Microsoft. January 2021, there is a freaking insurrection on the U.S. Capitol by a lot of people driven by conspiratorial views of irregularities in vote counts and other unfounded allegations, a lot of it tied back to QAnon theories, which go back to Satanic Panic theories about this global cabal operating in the shadows to rig decisions that the government makes. 2021 is also when Joseph, the black man targeted in Ohio, finally gets released on bond, after, in partnership with the Ohio Innocence Project, his lawyers file a motion for a retrial. This is also when the editor behind It Happened to Nancy admits, quote, "This woman was a con artist," unquote. And the fact-checker for the book about the AIDS stats claims to have no memory of ever working on this book. In 2021 and 2022, some people are fired from teaching and physician positions in Switzerland after a TV journalist report shows a continued presence of SRA theory perpetuators in their ranks. February 2022, A judge finally grants a motion for Joseph's new trial and accepts the DA's request for the dismissal of all charges against him. Not an expungement or anything, a dismissal. Now let's look at the state of things today. Tons of government funding that could have gone toward legitimate child-related concerns has been wasted on these trials, on the media coverage, on book sales, on so much that the money should have gone to elsewhere. Very concrete impact. So much more than just a book. It really led to changes in the behavior of people in power, of government funding, of public behavior. The anti-occult workshops left a big psychological imprint and skepticism in people. Eventually, Marcella Barrett had moved out of that home in Pleasant Grove, but had been initially hesitant. The woman who moved in had no idea when she moved in the stories behind the house. And they still get a lot of visitors there. People who want to see the gravesite, people who want to just be by this spooky ghost story associated house. Sometimes they even send mail there for the ghost of Alden, I guess. In the town, he's kind of like a legend, and not in a good way. He's just the ghost that haunts the town. Every 5 years or so, a new round of kids are growing up and discover Jay's journal, realize they are in the hometown of this whole story, and interest comes back up. But the library continues to not circulate Jay's journal, although it is in their catalog. They don't have physical copies in circulation. Art Linkletter actually changed dramatically later in life. He now admits, quote, "Almost all my assumptions about drug education were wrong," unquote. And he became an advocate for a treatment approach more than a criminalization approach to drug use. But it took him a long time and grieving process to get there. As for Alden's siblings, Elaine got married and is still with her high school sweetheart decades later. Scott eventually reconciled with his parents. Things have been very tense between them. He actually recently was slammed with some pretty severe criminal charges, but he maintains his innocence. Teresa, the love interest of Alden in his real life, has never read Jay's journal. She healed on her own for the most part, didn't really seek out professional help, but continues to think about how much she deeply truly loved Alden. Now she is a married mom of 3. The editor of It Happened to Nancy, Ellen Krager, became the VP and editorial director of children's literature at Simon & Schuster, where she has released more new editions of these Sparks books, for which Sparks gets a $50,000 advance. Other people who helped edit Sparks' novels, even after the fact, now it's kind of come to light that she was a liar, they really failed up in those careers. One of them became the VP of Prentice Hall's trade division until leaving publishing to focus on finance. The New York Times author Webster Schott, whose Go Ask Alice review really is credited with skyrocketing its name recognition, died in 2020. Shortly before his death, he did say a very odd, rambling answer about reflecting on, well, I kind of regret that, but also not really disavowing it. The more hard-nosed reporters, like Eileen Nilsson, the one banned from the funeral, also did, though, get career advancements. She's written several books on young adult literature now, and maintains a high status in writing circles. As for Toby and Brenda, the one who had struggled at that summer camp, is really in a better place now emotionally. She's overcome substance abuse, now works herself with at-risk youth, and earned multiple degrees. She also finds solace in faith and is still active in the Mormon Church. She has never read Go Ask Alice. Toby considers herself a not practicing Mormon. She actually lost touch with Brenda for years, but they reconnected in 2016 and still message each other to this day. Sandy, the one who passed out those pamphlets at Quantico, downplays her influence on this movement, not really taking responsibility. She claimed that she didn't really recall influencing court trials with her testimony. And after being shown the receipts, the transcripts, she reiterated, well, I don't remember that at all. She also basically said, look, I can't affect what other people say and do. I can't be responsible for that. Go Ask Alice has sold over 6 million copies. It continues to have 4 different entries in the Library of Congress with different titles. Sometimes it's fiction, sometimes not. One of these groups who campaigned against SRA, the Believe the Children group, is no more. But now we have new groups who have sprouted up to protect the children, they say. And to this day, people level accusations against pieces of pop culture, calling it satanic. People also throw in satanic conspiracies to legitimate crimes, like the crimes of Jimmy Savile and other public figures. A lot of celebrity activity is now linked to conspiracy theories about a cabal and their involvement or the fact they were a victim to it, depending on the political desires of the theorists. And as is very clear, if you live in the USA like me right now, there are still groups out there crusading against books and saying all this stuff is warping the minds of children. That attitude has not been dealt with. The media is also kind of feeding on itself again, growing on its own buzz, because book bans are in the news and then they keep happening. It's a weird cycle. And part of the reason for the Satanic Panic die down was when the news changed, and now it's back to this stuff. But previously, it had changed in the late 90s, and you had the Unabomber story, the O.J. Simpson trial. People's minds were elsewhere. Ed Jaggles, a defense attorney who got his rep and a lot of fame from the Bakersfield trial, still insists to this day he made the right call, forming a special task force about SRA. All but one of the 26 convictions he sealed have been reversed, but people liked what he did, and he's been reelected 6 times. Some defendants who were convicted of SRA claims are still locked up to this day. As for Beatrice herself, turns out she had kept copies of everything. All the publicity, the promo, the newspaper clippings, tons of physical proof of reviews, commentary on her books. She was keeping tabs on all of it, including the stuff about the truth and the stuff about what Alden's family was going through, their grief. She kept tabs and knew exactly what she was doing. She died with several projects still in the works, including a self-help book on happiness, and a book called Out of the Dark that was supposedly set to be based on audio from therapy sessions with one of her patients. Beatrice Sparks is now buried next to Lavorne, and her headstone reads, "Families are forever." Thinking big picture, I see all of these stories and how they combine. The true story of Alden and Teresa, warped into Jay's journal, the story of the grieving Barrett family, Beatrice exploiting our Linkletter after his daughter died, all of the grifters who made so much money on SRA claims, all these stories and how they relate, and of course just the political and cultural context. To me, it's all this big monster that seems to go to sleep and then wake up again over the years. Some years it's asleep, minds move elsewhere, other times it reawakens. It's not going away. And this monster was a composition of so much more than one bad actor like Beatrice, yet each player had a huge impact on others. Everyone played a role in this mass hysteria. By definition, the masses did. That's what's interesting about this phenomenon is, unlike a cult, there was never a main figurehead. And that made people more scared. There was no one to look to guide through times of uncertainty. Economically, historically, culturally, they needed something to latch onto to make sense of the world around them. And people saw that urge, especially in people of faith, and went to faith-based communities, some opportunists, some true believers, to grab their attention and spread the word about what could be their salvation. They spoke their language. And then elsewhere in the country, people spoke the language of officers, of concerned parents, of psychologists, of psychiatrists, of authors. It wasn't just one person, but every single person had a huge role, a ripple effect of people they may have influenced to believe this stuff with them, using the language of those identities and communities. So this is why so many unlikely alliances, you could say, were formed against a common enemy, SRA. Our country was falling apart at the seams, still is, and that's why this persists in part. And people want an answer. They want a singular narrative of why tragedy strikes, what's up with kids these days, why this is happening. And this was a way to do that, to feel like there's one big narrative we can all get behind. The problem is, it was not rooted in reality, and so everyone fell down when the foundation crumbled, and we're still picking up the pieces today and figuring out how to build a new foundation. It's hard to do now with all this distrust for each other. This story taps into so much about politics, Nixon's war on drugs, how people thought about LSD, made decisions on faulty research or lack of research. Actually, for a while, people thought LSD broke your chromosomes. It's about how narratives spread. It's about teen mental health. It's about suicide, how that connects to your faith, and how much then you are allowed as a parent to grieve. It touches on the debate still had sometimes in psychology communities about dissociative identity disorder and other real illnesses that could actually be what's happening, not a suppressed memory of SRA. This story also touches on misplaced fear. like when school boards defund mental health initiatives for fears of indoctrination or just transferring funds to SRA causes or other cracking down on the youth approaches. And then they wonder why the youth are still upset and not doing well. It's a story about true first love with Teresa and Alden and the intensity, because that love you feel as a teen, that first love, the only rush of joy sometimes in your young life, and you cling to that despite your parents maybe trying to take it away from you. And that can form rifts in the family, that can contribute to mental illness issues, acting out. This is also a story about boarding schools like Provo Canyon, who continue to take a punishment approach to dealing with young people's issues. This is a story about a lack of options, the fact they were talking about military schools, different camps they could send their kid to, instead of just a treatment center that would treat them right. It's a story about Mormon culture, small town life, how people like Alden might feel stifled by that. It's a story about truth, how quickly we might want to believe a certain thing, that a certain person's the perpetrator, the narratives we craft in our head, a lot based on the power of suggestion and what we want to be true. And if you desperately believe something is true, you can convince yourself eventually it is. It's about the young adult book market, what draws kids to books and how parental fury over them makes the book even more appealing. It's about misleading language in media reviews of books, calling it things like a document of horrifying reality. It's also about how the media framed Sparks herself as the savior like she wanted. How many people did not look into her claims, and they portrayed her as just a sweet, quote, cookie mama at the end of the day. It's about feeling like you connect with a book and trying to reconcile the dark truth of a book with maybe its real origin story and what is false about it. How to use books that you find solace in for true connection despite them being based in falsehoods. It's about misusing your credentials when you're in a position of trust and influence. It's about confirmation bias among police officers, investigators who don't want to be proven wrong, so when they have a suspect they've accused of something, they better hurry up and punish them. It's also about the concept of memory and how brains are notoriously faulty at remembering things correctly. That's why eyewitness testimony is so unreliable. It's why hypnotherapy is so controversial, because it's just a very, very complex topic. You need all the credentials, years of credentials, to be a true hypnotherapist, and even then some people are a bit skeptical. And it's also important to remember the nature of memory is not static. So your memory changes a bit every time you revisit it. So it's about all of these different facets of society and how they culminated into this mass hysteria event. So much more to say, honestly. It may sound like I've talked your ears off already, but truly there are endless angles you could dive into even more about this Satanic Panic. And we're going to talk about even more of it and the woman behind a lot of it, Beatrice Sparks. A great book I recently read dives into her true life story. So if you want more about the truth of what came out of this world of fiction she created for herself, I'm going to be talking with a very interesting author who has got the details. So stay tuned for the final installment in this series, and I will talk to you all again for our big conclusion very soon. Bye, everybody.